Just some of the reaction on Parliament Hill to news. The U.S. Supreme Court may end legalized abortion. That means Americans could seek services here. But accessibility is already a problem for some women in Canada. Karina Gould is the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development of Canada. Hi, Minister. Good to have you back on the program.
Thanks for having me, Vashi.
Minister, in the last election campaign, your party promised that as government, you'd establish regulations. I just want to read it verbatim from the platform. Under the Canada Health Act, governing accessibility for sexual and reproductive health services. So there is no question that no matter where someone lives, that they have access to publicly available sexual and reproductive health services. When do you plan to do that, and why haven't you already?
Well, it's really important because as we've seen as of today in the United States, there are many forces at play that are looking to roll back the hard-won rights of women in that country. And there are forces at play here in Canada. It's in Minister Duclos, the Minister of Health's mandate letter to do this through the Canada Health Act. And in fact, we have exercised this muscle with New Brunswick, for example, ensuring that they're providing access to abortion rights. And we'll continue to work on this with the provinces and territories.
So what you've done so far when it comes to New Brunswick is withhold some transfers, right? Which is part of what the platform promised to do as well. I think you've done it in at least 2 instances specific to New Brunswick. But the substance of the question was more aimed at the what you referenced with Minister Duclos. So when exactly will those regulations be introduced? When will the government be doing something like that?
Well, I believe we're working on them right now, but as you said, we've already acted, right? And we did that in the case of New Brunswick, and we'll continue to do that with provinces and territories because access to abortion services, to sexual health and reproductive rights services in Canada is a right. It was determined by the Supreme Court of Canada in the 1988 Morgentaler decision, and our government has committed to upholding that right.
It's not just New Brunswick, though, for example, where access is limited. I looked at some examples in preparing for this interview. Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Abortions are only, for example, offered in cities there where 35 to 40% of the population doesn't live in urban areas. Does your government plan to withhold transfers to those provinces, for example, or is it only focused on New Brunswick?
Well, New Brunswick was the example where they were planning to shut down Clinic 554, but of course, we want to expand access right across the country. And that's why it's important to be having this conversation. In fact, in last year's budget, we announced $45 million for community organizations to do just that, to expand access for vulnerable populations. You talk about here in Ontario, the previous Liberal provincial government had introduced legislation to provide a bubble around abortion clinics so that women and people seeking abortions and other sexual and reproductive health services wouldn't be harassed on the way to getting those services. Unfortunately, Ontario Premier Doug Ford rescinded that legislation. So today in Ontario, if people are seeking access to these reproductive and health services, they're being harassed, they're being targeted. This is unacceptable in Canada. Of course, this is provincial legislation, but that being said, that should not happen. So what we're seeing in the United States, we cannot assume that that will not happen in Canada because we're already seeing some of that very activity.
I think, though, that underscores, circling back to my first question, what exactly your government plans to do about it. Well, recognizing the jurisdictional issues that I think you just touched on, what your government promised in the campaign is to, for example, not just introduce those regulations, but set up sort of standards, parameters for what is equitable access, what qualifies as access. Your government hasn't done that. Your party also promised in 2019 to improve access in your platform, and you didn't. Other than holding back the money from New Brunswick, you haven't done that elsewhere. So why should Canadians trust you to make good on the promise you made in the last election when you haven't already and you had 6 years to do something and you didn't?
Well, so as I said, in last year's budget, we actually announced $45 million specifically for community organizations so that they can provide greater access to reproductive and sexual health services, specifically for vulnerable groups. We're also drafting those regulations. I mean, this is a process that does take a little bit of time, but Minister Duclos is working on it. It is in his mandate letter. Of course, over the past 2 years, we've been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. But at the same time, when I was Minister of International Development, one of the big announcements that I made was to invest in sexual health and reproductive services internationally, because what we saw in countries around the world, it didn't happen in Canada, but that was one of the first health services to be shut down. And so Canada really has been leading both at home and around the world. There's more work to do, but one of the things that Canadians know, and one of the things that Canadians trust about our government, is that we're not going to roll back women's rights. We're not going to roll back their access to reproductive health and health services. And that's something that we need to be very cognizant of, because particularly in the Conservative Party of Canada, there are 54 members that have been given the green light by the Campaign Life Coalition. 2/3 of them are self-identified as anti-abortion candidates. We have to protect this. These forces exist here in our own country. As you mentioned, several provinces where, actions are being taken. We have to be vigilant and we have to protect these rights.
And I take your point about the possibility of them rolling back and protection needed in that respect. But I guess my questions are focused on your government's promise to not just prevent them from rolling back, but to amplify the access that Canadians have. And I just want to get in one more question about specifically where the American context is concerned, because in response to the leaking of the draft opinion from the Supreme Court, the Prime Minister tweeted, "The right to choose is a woman's right and a woman's right alone. Every woman in Canada has a right to a safe and legal abortion. We'll never back down from protecting and promoting women's rights in Canada and around the world." On that last part, and around the world, I think it has some heightened significance today. Will your government ensure American women who want to can come to Canada for an abortion?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't see why we would not. I mean, if people come here and need access, certainly, that's a service that would be provided. We want to make sure that we're still able to provide those services as needed to Canadian women. But I will say that one of the concerning factors here is that there are many Canadian women who maybe don't live near a major city in Canada that will often access these services in the United States. So I'm very concerned about the leak yesterday. I'm very concerned about what this means, particularly for American women, but also for Canadian women. And just on that last point about, doing this around the world, Canada has been a leader in providing and championing sexual health and reproductive services internationally. Let's not forget that when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, he basically brought in a gag rule similar to what the American Republicans do when they're in power, which means that if there was an organization that provided either abortion services or promoted the fact that women could access an abortion, they would lose funding from the government of Canada. We changed that as soon as we came into office in 2015, and we need to make sure that we are protecting this right here in Canada and around the world. 25 million unsafe abortions happen every single year. Criminalizing abortion doesn't mean that those abortions won't happen. What it means is they will be unsafe abortions.
And I take your point, but on the point you made, for example, of the Canadians who are going to America to get an abortion, does that not, I guess, keep underscoring the impetus, the pressure on your government to make good on the promises it continues to make, but has yet to fully deliver on?
Absolutely. And that's why those $45 million last year for community organizations was really important. And that's why this is in Minister Duclos' mandate letter, and working through the Canada Health Act, to ensure, as we've done in New Brunswick, but we need to keep doing more, and we have to keep working with provinces and territories. But it's also important for us to recognize that, as you mentioned, provinces and territories are responsible for the delivery of healthcare services. We will protect that right, and we will keep working to expand it.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.